recording now.
Some people might try
Hello?
to walk down the hall, that's all.
Oh, that was me. Never mind. I just got a message. It's not today. I'm gonna kill this one. Do we have an agenda for today's meeting?
Nope. Mike?
It's a, we're reviewing the two proposed legislation, two proposed bills.
Michael take the lead on it because he was kind of scheduling it.
All right. Do we have any results from minutes from last meeting so we can have guidance?
We don't have any minutes from the last meeting,
All right.
but we are reviewing the two bills, so and this is really what.
Okay, we're gonna
first
review the
getting
two
into
bills.
this.
Will you mention the third at all?
No.
Not at all. Okay. All right.
Now, if people have ideas on Monday, that's a good thing.
I've been given some suggestions as to things that are outside the scope of a fee. One of them is a gain share idea, where we either gain share off savings that are accumulated because of the prospective savings and what we do, and the suggestion was made by the governor's office by an individual there, that we create a firm that can actually go out and get a loan based on the potential gain share, turn it and monetize the gain share,
What's that?
and then pay back the loan. And that would give us seed money. And so the question is, what kind of gain share might we expect?
I'm gonna, we need to start tracking our meetings, how many meetings we've had. So I'm gonna do that
That are
on one of these spreadsheets in here.
so it's only pays for the accumulation of opportunity, and it takes
If the calendar continues
because, and then we take the gain share
properly, you know, maybe,
and back the loan.
I wanna make sure we have a,
And then we have dollars to cycle back, because we now have an opportunity for a lease base, at least the, the and then that money recycles the money, recycles the money. The loan's paid off.
So it's revolving fund in that
Creates
sense.
revolving.
hello, who joined?
Hi, Susan Annabelle joined.
Hi, Susan. And then we had another suggestion that we take donations into the E-rate fund, which is already part of asset, because we have closely tied this to schools. And then it would fit then inside the purposes of the E-rate fund. Although it may not be directly directed at E-rate, it is for purposes of education. And those donations then act as seed money, and then we refund the fund after through the circulation of the dollars.
Donations from
What am I
type
gonna
of
do
source?
with Addie's?
Well, there's there's that commitment that was made to the ACC when the class was purchased. That might be a suitable donation for a while, and then have that refunded after it's been taken care of.
That one.
That one, remember that? It's $60 million there?
That's 70 million, but it's over a period of time, and it's tied actually to physical plant, not to cash.
Okay.
So, I mean, we wouldn't,
You gotta spend the physical plant somewhere. This is creating physical plant. So
it's a different tax. It's a completely different tax.
Anyway, so there's some donation possibilities that maybe from.
So she knows who's on the phone.
Again, let me interrupt and do some housekeeping. I think we probably want to officially start the meeting.
Right.
It's about 5 minutes after 1:30. Is anyone, for those folks that are on the phone, would you like to tell us who you are and what your affiliation is, please?
It's just Susan Annabelle.
Susan.
And Susan, we know you're there. Are you the only, anyone else on the phone besides Susan?
That's it.
That's all he can
Just it.
Okay, very good. So we have Susan Annabelle with Cox on the phone, and then Mike Keeling with Keeling Law Offices and Data Site Consortium here.
Jenny Nauman, technology lawyer, City of Tempe.
Hi, Susan, Mike DeMaria.
Galen Updike with Asset.
Eric Thomas, project manager with the project.
And Jeff Crane.
And that's our group this afternoon. There may be a few others that join us.
I invited a couple, and I don't know if they're gonna be here or not. I think it's
Yes.
verification.
I had email conversation with Bob Burns, and I don't believe he's joining in today, but he's definitely talking to the legislature.
Ah, here he is right now. Speaking of, Bob, you're here, you should be ready.
We were
Sorry,
just,
wait.
your timing is good, Bob. We
Oh,
were
okay.
just introducing ourselves, and so if you'd like to introduce yourself, we'll
All
start
right,
out.
Bob Burns, Arizona Senate, retired.
Very good. And that's our group today. We're here to talk about two draft bills, the two highways for one, or the digital highway, as it's sometimes being called now, and the office, the broadband infrastructure office, infrastructure development office, and then potentially talking about some funding, although that hasn't reached the bill status at this point, but Galen mentioned some concepts for funding. So if we could first focus to the two highways for one bill, because I think that's the one that's closest to being ready to launch. And in earlier conversations with Senator Burns, the idea was to get those ready for launch as quickly as we can on it. And so if we can start out with that bill, and the latest version is a version that was emailed out. I think that Jeff emailed out to everyone on the committee. Could we start with that one? And anyone would like to start this conversation there?
The question was, the one that was emailed out, right after our last meeting, you emailed out a document, and then you emailed it out again. Was there really any change on the
There
two
should not have
highways?
been, no.
I didn't notice any.
There was one that emailed at 7:07, one that emailed, that's one of two, two of two. And
Right.
That was done at 7 o'clock yesterday morning. Is that correct?
Is that what you're referring to? The two emails?
No, I think maybe it was the one that was passed out. I mean, I didn't notice that there was any, the
Does it
latest
say-
one said version 7, but I couldn't really tell on the document.
Does
The
it-
latest one is version 7.
And does it say the office?
And
No, this is the other one.
This is the,
Oh, I'm sorry.
This is the two highways.
Okay.
okay, the version 7 is the latest one. So you are looking, you're looking at version 7.
And I just wondered if it was any different. Well, I don't know if this is version 7.
Okay. And no, there weren't
No changes.
significant changes between the two. And in fact, in our review with ADOT on version 7, the issue that they have is with the wording director shall. And so the input from this committee would be softening that language to an acceptable. And I asked Floyd what would be acceptable from him. He hasn't come back. I know he's circulating internally that question, but he hasn't come back. But I think from the perspective of this committee, hi, Emerson.
Hello.
From the perspective of this committee, what language would be, and what in particular word that they're concerned with is shall on it, and what language is appropriate in order to for ADOT to have a strong sense of that they should be going down this set of doing this set of activities without the use of the word shall or must.
Well, the only other word that I'm familiar with is may. It's either usually shall or may.
And may is usually permissive, where shall
Right.
is affirmative.
So it depends on whether you want to sort of direct them or just have them cooperate.
Discussion?
Well, isn't it a question of money? I mean, the,
Well, we can limit it to when money's available, so and so that could be a modifier as well, yes.
The question that's always been with regard to right-of-way from the very start, when I began my inquiries 7 years ago as to what was needed, they said to me, Transportation said to me that they had never been directed to do anything with their particular role, except build roads. And that it would take something from the legislature to direct them to be concerned about broadband right-of-way or building some kind of, as they engineer the road, engineer a place for right-of-way for broadband, fiber. And the suggestion then to me was, if they will direct us to do it, we'll do it. Now, the question has always been about cost. And you could give a proviso based on available funding.
Right, and I think we do want to do that.
And so the word shall accept that, and say shall accept that mitigated by available funding or something.
Based on available funds. But now then, let's talk about that a little bit, because let's say that we do make that, that distinction for actual construction. But when you build a road, you start out going through the rights of way, the easements, rights of way, design, construction management aspects, and with planning inputs from the COGS, et cetera. And if the additional conduits are baked into that planning process, and the easements and rights of way that are negotiated, such that it's incrementally negotiated to have the rights of way and easements for telecommunication services as well as for vehicles, then I believe that's where a great deal of the economy is to be gained. So even though the actual construction may be a function of available funds, it's, I think, that upfront planning, we want to bake into that upfront planning the telecommunications conduits. Discussion on that.
And perhaps the word is shall consult with.
Well, now we've got to consult with for the council or for the office.
I'm talking about there is a cost associated with engineering also. And unless they get funding to pay for additional engineering costs, then they wouldn't do it. And we also need to also go back and look at the selected sections of highway that the authority is going to take a look at, or the office is going to take a look at.
But before we go down that path, I'd like to stay on this language for a minute, and I'd like to talk about the cost of the engineering. What almost all roads now have is they have ITS conduit. And so it may well, and if they're going to do engineering for ITS conduit, ITS is Intelligent Transportation Systems conduit, then what we're talking about is an incremental number of conduits. And so arguably in the planning, that incremental number of whether you carry 4 conduits or 1 or 2, into planning stage, I don't really see that being a significant difference in the cost.
Would they engineer differently for their own intelligent fiber, their own, versus where an outsider comes in and utilizes it?
And the answer to that may well be yes.
I'm curious to know why ADOT doesn't want shall, because there is already a disclaimer in the first bullet that says as determined by the director. If as determined by the director, the appropriate number is 0, you're still in compliance with the way the statute reads.
Correct. We've given them that
surprises
language
me
to start with. But,
go ahead.
But good question.
But again, if they don't like directed.
But they don't like to be directed.
Yeah.
And so that's a cultural. They've got an out and on funding, or for whatever the purpose that the director believes is appropriate not to do it, but they don't like the fact that they're being directed to, even though it's the legislature that is making the statement. So they would like to have that language softened from that perspective. Now we have some real life considerations that Galen was bringing up, but going back more fundamentally to what's the beef. What's the real issue from ADOT's perspective, knowing that they have the out, because that language was intentionally put in and discussed with Floyd up front. There still is that desire not to have the director shall language in the bill.
But the flip side is if you
My suggestion is put the shall in, and you can always back off to may later. If you really want them to do something, you need to tell them shall, and work towards that. And then if the agency continues to resist having shall, then maybe you can negotiate a different term that works out, or you can negotiate them into a position where they support it without the word shall. I mean, that's what I would think is, and it'll depend on the sponsor of the bill as well. The sponsor of the bill is going to want to have some footprint in all of this.
Who's the transportation chair, I know?
You know, I don't even know who the chairs are. I met with Wendy this morning, Wendy Baldo, who's the chief of staff at the Senate, and told her what we were trying to get to, that we were in the preliminary stages and that we would like to get to a consensus of language and then have that language brought to the legislature and have a folder opened, because a folder can be changed. So if we could get something in, at least in the preliminary stages, and get it into a folder, then the people on the council can all look at it and decide whether there's things in there they can't live with or whatever, or want changes, and it can be changed while it's in the folder. The last day for bill introduction in the Senate this coming session will be January 31st. And the House will have one more week. So that will be the drop dead date as far as getting a folder turned into a bill draft.
Is the sequence important?
Well, you know, what could be part of the issue, and again, because the discretion to spend the dollars, because of so much sweeping, that, you know, Mike, I don't know if one of the concerns may be, okay, the funds are allocated, they don't have the ability, 12 months, to spend those dollars, want to be able to put those dollars into an account that's gonna be specifically for this, without being swept back out, and have the discretion to be able to put, I mean, we'd have to put some parameters around that, but I wonder if it's just more about discretion of how those dollars are allocated inside their general fund, and if they're concerned that any additional dollars in there are gonna be seen as a target, because then they have money sitting in transportation funds that, you know, could go after again.
That could be a concern.
If you're trying to make things mushy, in a sense, you can always have because you have an introductory thing, something like where appropriate the director shall install, or when appropriate, or something that sets up the, you know, if all things kind of work out, you've got the money, you've got the space, it makes sense. I mean, it does seem a little obvious that anytime you open up a hole in the ground, you should probably throw conduit in it. Kind of like you shouldn't probably build any type of building without making sure that a computer can operate in it. But it's Arizona, so there may well be an ADOT project on a road somewhere that's just not connected to anything, and maybe it doesn't make sense for conduit. And so maybe, and if there's no money, or if the cost benefit is such that it doesn't make sense, they want it out. But we're almost saying if all the stars align, we don't want you to have an out. And then
Well,
you're
can you
supposed
say
to-
it shall be a general policy that, and then back off from the
Yeah,
general
one way,
policy?
you know, folks, they could attack this, or one way to address it is to figure out what are the specific conditions that ADOT feels like have to be met in order for them to be compelled to do this,
Right.
and make those conditions. You know, you can have A, B, C, and D, and say, if, you know, if the project meets the following requirements and there's funding available, the director shall. My concern is if you just leave it as may, they have the discretion to say no under any circumstances. And I think there has to be some criteria or parameters given to this that gives them the comfort that, okay, if all these conditions are met, we're okay doing this.
Let me kind of summarize what I think I've heard from around the table. If one we could go with shall, we could drop the bill as is with ADOT, the director shall. Two, we could put a clause, a beginning clause of when appropriate, where appropriate, or
Subject
kind
to
of
available
beginning
funding,
clause.
whatever the
Yes.
hook is.
Third, we could go, and Susan, your suggestion is we could go back to Floyd, back to ADOT with in an attempt to establish a list of conditions. And when those conditions are met, and these would be positive conditions such that when those are met, then the director would plan and construct conduit with new highway.
Yeah, and I think to Susan's point, that tightens up the language quite a bit. I mean, it takes a lot of ambiguity out of the situation for ADOT by being able to put those criteria. At the end of the day, for speed and for the ability not to haggle with a department, that sort of idea makes it much cleaner all the way around.
It's already in here, actually. If you look at B, it says that the director shall establish standards to carry out the purposes that look at population density. So maybe when the standards are met.
And so we may, in our negotiations back with ADOT, so it sounds like we want to go through a series of negotiations with ADOT. And we would most desire to have specific conditions. So maybe it's taking our current language and making that more crisp is one of those ways to do that, barring being able to get to that level of specificity in the time frame. Then we either could drop the bill with the shall language as is, or we could drop it with the when appropriate director shall
Or
suggestion.
subject to meeting the standards of section B, something like that. Because if B says that the directors.
How much input has ADOT had on the existing language?
Pretty much, they read it, they were bemused by the fact that there was a shall in there. They wanted to somehow mitigate that. They didn't say if we could mitigate the shall to make it sensical, and so that it met certain conditions, they would accept the shall. That seemed to be the sense that I
Yeah,
had.
because they're coming up with the
Is that what you
standards.
guys heard?
No, not at all. He was adamant on not wanting shall in there in any way.
He went through and redlined every shall out of, but then as we got back into the conversation,
Without them here, it's moot. Wait and see what they say back.
So I think we need to enter into that negotiation. Just to pick up on Jeff's point, we did get, we did hit a solid, we hit a nerve there, we hit a
Yeah.
solid wall
Right.
there.
And that's the first thing he
of the-
started out with, was
Right.
we've got to get rid of the
And-
shall.
And then we
and
tried to
we understood
chew away
that,
with
but
that.
as the conversation continued, it became the fact that, hey, we are in a new age. These transportation corridors go where we need to have them go.
Yeah, but not the shall part.
I
Again,
know, but
we aren't gonna solve
Because,
that one today.
Okay.
yeah, in order to kind of get through what we need to get through today,
And I have a couple of other questions that I wanted to ask about where it's appropriate for these two thoughts.
Okay.
Number one, is there in law in the state of Arizona a special classification for critical infrastructure? Does the word critical infrastructure act as a term of art that triggers other types of either benefits or tax benefits, tax breaks, those types of things? And I don't know the answer to that.
okay, but we can research that.
I-
And then your second question.
And the second question has to do with the idea of changing the definition of transportation to include information. The purpose of, and the federal has, vehicular transportation, all the transport of goods and services, et cetera. And changing the definition of what is transported to include
Yes.
information.
Very good.
I can tell you, my folks would have a heart attack over that because of the federal definitions, the way they are, as it relates to information services. And there is some language federally, because we're a carrier of last resort, which becomes critical infrastructure because we're a carrier of last resort for E911 in a lot of rural areas. So there is, not so much on the state level, conflicts on the federal level, some things I know our guys would have serious heartburn
Very
with both of those.
good. And Eric, did you have any?
I would say one thing on the critical infrastructure term, I know based on former project, there is some language that attaches responsibility for critical infrastructure to DPS.
Yes, right.
So be cautious about where you want that.
Well, and that was a specific law that was carried by Harper.
I'm just saying,
some years
just
ago.
be aware of what, if you bring that into play, be careful what you're bringing into
And I
play.
understand that, and that specific, that assigned at certain times DPS to be the steward of quote critical infrastructure. You could specifically reference that law and create an exception or create a different meaning for this one if you needed to.
And that's why we came up with the term
Yeah.
essential
Yeah.
infrastructure. which, because at this point, in our search of Arizona statute, essential infrastructure does not have a statutory meaning or definition.
Right.
So that we thought we could then
Critical
derive or
infrastructure.
suggest one for, within some of this legislation here.
And so my question was, I knew the critical infrastructure became a term of art, that DPS was over. And that was done on a very, I remember when that bill went through, I remember consternation that we felt about it because it was directed at something, and it actually put some things into DPS that I don't think were intended.
And again, just so you know, the concern over essential, critical, things of that nature, it has a tendency to move us long-term into something else that gets beyond the intent of what you're trying to come to. And then when the federal government can decide we're essential or critical, that changes the makeup of our plant and some ability for things that they can do through regarding privacy. There's a whole slew of things you'd have to look into to make sure that that's covered, because you wouldn't want to get yourself into that bailiwick.
Good point, Mike. Could we then focus back to our 2 highways for 1? Because I'd like to try to launch that one as quickly as we can. I think that's the one where we can be successful time-wise. We talked about ADOT. Now, the good news is ADOT had one problem. They did not have problems with any other aspect of this final draft at this point, or at least if there are other ADOT problems, they haven't been voiced with this draft number 7. For this group, in reading the draft bill, are there any issues that you see, deficiency or changes that should be made? Question.
I think we're gonna find that out when you talk to ADOT again.
Well, again, we're kind of singling them out, and making them special, but in addition to their issue, do any of the other stakeholders find issues with the bill as drafted at this point? Yes.
Not that you're gonna say that.
Susan, from your perspective, deficiencies or issues with the version 7 of the bill draft?
Just a couple of things, probably more to clarify more than anything else. I know we've talked about this before, but the idea that the conduit would be separate for different providers, and I know that maybe it's getting a little bit into the weeds, but in A1, it talks about appropriate number of broadband conduits there, and it talks about accommodating multiple broadband providers. It must bear a little more clarity around that to make it clear that it's not intended that providers share the same conduit.
Very good. And Mike, I think that's an important issue from your perspective as well, is the idea, this notion that no conduit is a shared conduit, because that came up in our earlier conversations. Mike Golden is not here, but let me carry on a bit of that conversation. What's the definition of a conduit? And the idea is that for whatever that sheathing is around a particular fiber, that within that sheathing, an inner tube, for an example, inner duct, for an example, that is solely the domain of a given carrier or provider, but that there may well be more than one of those inner ducts within an overall raceway. And so it depends at what level we're critiquing.
Well, yeah,
as a lead.
you can have conduit, and then you can have the inner ducts within them, and then within the inner ducts, you can have the microducts. And I mean, so it's possible to sort of have your own space.
Yes.
In an inner duct within a conduit, so you don't necessarily need the whole conduit.
And that's the whole point,
But you
because
need
that's a
secured
conduit
access.
price. And so Susan and Mike, I think since that issue is particularly of concern for your organizations, and the idea of there being inner duct within a conduit, or whatever that overall raceway is, and then that inner duct may have microducts in it, And the reason for the microducts is it's much easier to blow. The terminology in an industry is to blow fiber through it, through the microduct within an interduct. Question is, at what level is acceptable for non-shared space from your perspective?
Are you looking at it from a size perspective, or are you looking at, I mean, there's a couple different ways you can look at this based on individual, I mean, Susan, we've talked before, individual sheathing, I mean, there's a couple different ways you can look at inside the conduit, because it's just, you know, I think we had an idea from Mike originally that there was a size perspective. I think he was looking at into individual conduits, and I think we would define, could we define the different levels of conduit that way? Would
Yeah, I
that
think
be-
you almost have to, because,
Right.
I mean, you know, it started out with conduit and pulling fiber
Right.
through, but now it's gotten down
Inside of-
so tiny that even on a microduct, you'll have sort of little tiny.
Right.
I'm
ducts with
wondering, I'm
them.
wondering if the word "at least" ought to be entered into.
Well, and now, and we probably, and this actually doesn't have to all be in this, in statute, although the more statute is in statute, the more it's cast in stone. So you'll probably want, you know, to some extent to have it in statute. But it also, it turns out that in this draft, this actual decision is not made by ADOT, but it's made by the council or the office, if the office comes into existence.
Is it suitable to, in fact, state a purpose, to have a purpose statement within the law?
Well,
To give guidance?
you have legislative intent clauses.
Okay, is the legislative, as part of the law itself?
Yeah.
Are they outside the law?
Huh? No, I think they're printed right on the statute.
And the purpose
It's
is.
separate, but with.
And the purpose is to provide independent access
Yeah,
by different providers. And so, and that's where you want to maybe use the word at least 8
well, or
separate independent conduits.
you get in trouble the more you try to deal with today's technology,
That's a
because it's
problem
gonna
in
be
statute.
expensive. But saying what you just said, and, you know, a sufficient number of conduits or interduct that will allow for independent, you know.
Independent access by separate providers.
Multiple
Whose
So you get
purpose-
that idea
Right.
in there without dictating too much.
I agree with Danae's suggestion. I think that might help bring some clarity around that issue. The purpose statements are nice, but they really don't have the effect of law. It's better to try to clarify the best we can in the language while respecting the, evolving technology, which is the challenge.
So where it says the size of each conduit is consistent with it could be the size of each conduit and or interduct or the number, I mean, to the extent that you're leaving a lot of discretion.
So,
I think it's
so
good.
let's add language there. Does anyone want to take on that language? Hearing none, I'm glad to straw man the language, but I really would like to make sure we're getting input
We should
from
have
the
the-
people
we
most
have-
interested.
We have the engineer from ADOT that's on this committee, so he would,
Well,
Maybe
now
we
from
don't
their
know.
perspective, they are not worried about what goes in the outside raceway. But that, quick question here, but that is within purview as it's been determined between Mike Golden and ADOT. What goes in the raceway is determined by the council, of which this is a subgroup of, task group.
They'll manage the ditch.
Or the office, if the office is defined in legislation.
it does make some, I mean, putting in just another conduit that's, 1 1/4 inch versus, I mean, conduits they can be all different sizes. So to some extent, it probably does matter to ADOT, the number and the size.
Well, yeah, with the
But then they
size.
don't care what's going on within the
With,
conduit.
It's the within.
the within is the part that they will back to the DOA/ACIT, either within a council context or within a broadband infrastructure office context. Because they're saying they're not specialists in that area, and rather than they're getting involved in trying to arbitrate that, they'd rather somebody else do that and merely tell them what size of outside conduit or raceway and how many of them they should be putting in, acting as a construction manager. And so they would like that input given to them, rather than they're getting in the middle of trying to wrestle with what those specifics are. That's
Where
where
that
it
comes
comes
into
coming
play
from.
is when you get to bridges and crossing other rights of way, and the actual physical structure and engineering of it becomes an issue depending on how big it is and how much that.
But they still don't care
But
what's
they
inside.
still handle that outside the conduit versus inside. Eric, did you have?
I
any-
do. In the comment, there's an offhanded reference in a couple places to vaults. I'm assuming in addition to the security of the separately accessible fiber, you also have that same issue in the vaults. Is that implied by the way this is worded or not?
We've tried to write this to imply that, but let's talk about that because again.
It's the same sort of access, you're gonna want multiple
vaults.
diverse points going into the vault.
Controlled access.
Yeah, into this.
Again, like I say, it's kind of implied in that, but it just
But-
talks about the
and-
vaults.
But let's talk about that a little bit. And Susan, you probably want to weigh in on this as well. Where at the termination points or regeneration points, but the idea is that those separate internal raceways would terminate into a lockable space that where the only entity that has the key to that lockable space would be ADOT as the construction manager and maintenance manager for the physical plant and the particular provider of that particular space.
That just gets more challenging if you're sharing conduit. Conduit you can control it, but internet you can't.
Well, actually, I think there are designs to do that.
Okay, sorry.
But Susan, your comment?
So I agree with how you just described it, Mike, that I think throughout the infrastructure, the need to have secure access for each provider to their own fiber and other equipment would be key, and how to describe that in the legislation so it covers everything appropriately, I think is the challenge we have, is to try to make sure that that's clear, to provide for independent and secure access for each provider to their facilities in the conduit.
I like your language of throughout the infrastructure. Is that, Mike, does that sound like the kind of language that we should probably? Okay.
Most of that can be handled in the definitions also, supported in the definitions.
And from the city's perspective, have you dealt with some similar kinds of issues where there's similar
Well, see-
language that would make sense?
Well, see, typically, when the trench is dug, if it's a joint trench, then each provider is probably having their own conduit. I don't think that we have, sometimes when the independent provider, they'll lease out fiber, so they somehow figure out how to have other people access it, especially if they're leasing dark fiber. That's gonna be a situation where they do it, but how they do it, I don't really know. But obviously, that's an issue if somebody wants to access it independently.
But I think for the bill language, if we say that throughout the infrastructure, that the independent path, the separate path, will be preserved. It's that kind of language. We'll do some wordsmithing on that, but I think that's the concept. And if that's in the ARS, then any rules or any follow-up of that will then adhere to that concept.
And one of the other qualifications that needs to be made clear, even in this legislation, is the level of expertise, the kind of an ETC type situation, eligible telecom provider, or L1, maybe we'll create a new name like an eligible broadband provider or something. And and you can then refer to eligibility includes ILEC or CLEC status by the ACC, or ETC status established by the Arizona Corporation Commission for purposes of E-rate.
But aren't there gonna be a lot of providers that are not regulated by the ACC?
We're not saying, we're talking about eligible to in fact have access to these conduits. There has to be, or if they're a state contractor, for example, there's some eligibility that's provided there. There's a number of or type situations, but I think what it does is give a preemptive type access to these conduits by those already involved in the telecommunications industry that are already eligible through other processes like the ACC, for example. In other words, CLEX
Well,
and ILEX are
procurement,
special.
right? Wouldn't, I mean, if you're a qualified bidder, I think you're talking about who's qualified to install, or who's qualified to,
You're talking about
To
installing or
use.
using?
well, or to put cable, if you're gonna put cable in the conduit. I think that's
So,
what you're talking about.
see, the fiber is going to be owned by the entity that
The
fills, the provider that fills the conduit. And not everybody, not, you know, we need to have some sense that there's, just not any citizen who says and hangs up a shield and says, I am a broadband provider, can have access to these. There has to be some qualifications.
Well, and that was my question, because wouldn't there be, potential broadband providers that aren't an ILEC? or-
That's potential, and so the question becomes protecting yourself as a state through the things we would do at a local level with you, insurance requirements,
Right.
bonding requirements, those sort of things, because that's where you have to cover yourself at the end of the day. Because they could be eligible entities, and just use the word entities, but the entities, what is ADOT gonna require? Because that's almost a question to ADOT. What would they want as a minimum requirement to be inside their rights of way, you know, from those perspectives?
Right. Now again, from ADOT's perspective, they're a construction manager for the raceways. But they don't want to be the administrator associated with who's eligible to use it.
But it's not putting it, it's discussing with them, if someone goes into the conduit and they damage ADOT's property in the process, now whether it's in the rules of the authority, you know, of the organization that's gonna do the oversight, but it's something to ask them about, because that's gonna be something they're gonna want covered, which is if any entity goes in there.
We have
Mark?
asked about that, Jeff.
Oh, you were gonna go. During that meeting with Floyd, he did mention that they would take a role as a risk manager for
Okay.
those instances
Right.
when you are pulling the conduit or pulling the cable through the conduit. They would act
Right.
as the facilitators for that, being on site, controlling the access,
Okay.
egress, ingress, that type of thing.
Because they have safety concerns,
Right.
and
Sure.
it turns out that what Floyd wants to do, what ADOT wants to do, is use exactly their standard procedures right now for
Right.
anyone who is operating with, along the roadway within the various levels of safety zones along the roadway. And only the approved vendors, contractors that they already have, or that they would put in place specifically for this type of work, will then be allowed to actually do the construction work of pulling a fiber. And then the exact same thing for the maintenance. They will oversee the maintenance. They will utilize either their existing maintenance contractors or new maintenance contractors that specifically have the skill sets required for maintaining the fiber and the raceways over the lifetime of that infrastructure. And so rather than our having to recreate that whole 9 yards, they would rather that we merely piggyback on what they already have, and then they'll accommodate any new specific requirements that a given contractor may require in order to do this specific fiber-related work. And that's why they want us to think of them as a construction manager that already has those kinds of processes in place,
Yeah.
those risk management elements in place. Jeff, did you want to comment further?
Just that he was very adamant about they take the CM role, the risk management role, and then the administrative security role of.
is theirs,
Yeah.
and they don't want to change those processes any more than necessary for accommodation.
Right.
So what they really don't want, which I think is good in
Right.
terms of our scope here, as well as when it goes to the members for their reflection, is we're not trying to recreate all that, but we're rather trying to utilize what's in place.
And my point is this, we actually have a finite space. We don't, and so, and we have physical parameters that fill that finite space. So eventually, if 8 conduits are not enough to fulfill all the demand, now we have to have a top-down approach to make sure that there's a shall we say, a process of approval of who can have who have access, or who has standing to have access for the particular.
Well, the question then though becomes the whole thing of underserved and,
Right.
I mean, if you've got that many people in there, that that changes probably that dynamic at that point,
Well,
that's a little different.
Well, and so that
Scope.
that idea of 8 conduits isn't a uniform number throughout the state, but in the far reaches of the state where there's not a lot of population to be reached by those conduits, 8's probably the wrong number. And there may be other parts of the state where 8's is insufficient, although 8's a pretty large number. But the point is that that number varies with location, yes.
Right, I would say as a practical matter, I mean, my understanding, the way I look at the problem is almost like poll attachments. And it would have to be first come, first served. And no one's gonna come in there and ask, to put in conduit unless they have a purpose down the road. And if they see that the space is already gone, there's probably not any incentive for them to come in there.
There needs to be some process where somebody's given authority to prevent gaming of the system.
Well, and at this point,
That's not this.
That's not
You're
this.
absolutely right, that needs to
But
be,
that's
but
not,
that's not
that's
this.
not what we're talking
Okay.
about right now. That's a requirement up there at a high level, but on the ground for
Right.
what we're doing here, that's not this.
Yeah.
And the question is,
Mike,
Yes.
this is Susan, one thing to consider, and I know this is a little bit in the weeds, but it should be thought about, whether it's a rulemaking or direction given to ADOT if they want this responsibility to come up with parameters. But you may have situations where you have providers who are in that conduit who may have a change in ownership. You may have a transfer of ownership and acquisition. How do you handle those situations? And furthermore, and unfortunately, you may have a provider who goes in there and then at some point is no longer in business. What's the responsibility for managing that asset such that somebody can remove property that, fiber that's in there in order to allow other providers to use it? I mean, I know those are kind of questions that are down the road, but it's something to think about because those are things that absolutely happen in our business all the time.
Yes, indeed, Susan. Now, those kinds of things, as well as the eligible provider, are conceptually in the other piece of legislation we want to talk about. The ADOT breakout was to break out a clean, small scope that we could run with more quickly, and that made sense to ADOT and would accommodate what ADOT is doing, such that it really is ADOT centric.
so that's
Now those
two
other things.
two highways for the price one is ADOT centric.
Correct. Now, those other things are in what we're calling the office right now. We call the authority, so you may have a little bit of documents on the authority, but it's now called the office. It is that entity that has to grapple with those things that we've been talking about now for several minutes. And if we could put those aside while we go forth with the ADOT, I think then maybe we can move the ADOT bill forward just with its limited scope. Not saying that we won't address those others, but because we'll do that next when we dig into the office legislation.
And I- this-
And then in this scenario, who ultimately owns the conduit? Is it ADOT or is it the office?
Who owns the conduit?
Yep.
That's a good question. The bill at this point does not address who owns it. It addresses who manages it, and is thought of as a state ownership. But so Susan, maybe if we can parse a little bit the ownership, and the state owns it, but it's managed by ADOT for the physical infrastructure and maintenance of it, whereas the usage of it is managed by the broadband office.
Does the state rent the conduit?
And the state rents the conduit, and the monies that are made those rents go into a revolving fund in order to build additional conduit.
And those rents are basically associated with the cost of the building of the conduit, not some rate-based commercial value.
But again, that's not part of
No, that's not
ADOT,
part.
so I'd like to, yes, Eric?
I would ask ADOT, is there any other scenario within their rights of way where they do not own the physical run? Do you know that? Because I would think they would not want it to be different than whatever else they're
Well,
already
and
doing.
that's based on our early discussion with ADOT, is that ADOT doesn't actually own the road, but it is the manager of the road for the state. So the state is the entity that owns, but the ADOT is the entity that manages.
Stewart.
But
Jeff, did
ADOT
you have a comment on that?
ADOT acting as a construction manager is acting in the role of putting it in for the customer. Customer being asset of the office.
Correct.
The state.
And then the title, I think going to Susan's question, the title is actually resides with the state of Arizona as an entity.
Not ADOT.
Does that clarify,
Yeah.
are we all
Yeah.
on a similar song sheet?
Bob, is there any other
ADOT had no
entities like this in the
No,
state where,
at all.
these, where we
Yeah,
have
but
guidance
it's
from
an
other
agency.
legislation that are similar to
ADOT's not
this,
gonna
like,
own
for
that
example, are waterways owned by the state, by citizens of the state? Or are they
Asset would be
typically
the
owned
customer.
by people who,
They're putting it in
pipelines
for,
are owned
and
by
then
the
they turn it over to the
individuals who
customer.
put them in? Is there anything that, any other entity like where the state citizens own something, like roads?
Not that I know of, I mean, off the top of my head,
There's largely two categories, as I understand it. There's the state lands, which are owned in trust, and so there's a trust there. And that is always distinguished in law from a property of the state. And the property of the state can be personal or real property of the state, but there's a distinction with regard to the state land, trust lands, and by law, they are treated differently. So those are now, arguably, they're both state property, but they're held differently, and they are treated by ARS differently on it, but they're still state
Right.
property. So it's kind of like asking, does DOA own the buildings? Well, no, it doesn't own the buildings, but it manages the buildings for the state of Arizona, the owner of the building. And the buildings, for example, are not owned in trust, but they're owned outright in fee simples, and the land under them fee simple, as opposed to being owned in trust. But I think for the purposes of what we're wanting to do here, we should think of the state as being the owner, the title holder. We should think of ADOT as being the manager of that property of the state. And then, Susan, back to your point of a change in ownership, that would be a change in the possessor of a lease, a long-term lease of the right-of-way and the raceway. And oftentimes how SPO constructs those contracts is they allow for survivorship and for change of ownership of an entity as well as survivorship rights of the entities. And so, for example, if I have a state contract for services with the state through my company, and I sell my company to another entity, as long as that entity buys the company, buys the stock in my company, it now buys all the liabilities and benefits of the company, including the state contract. So that's what's actually in the uniform terms and conditions of the state procurement documents for how to handle that situation. The office, which we'll talk about next, will need to broach those kinds of issues in that legislation, and it may well be that we have a model with the state procurement office on the level of ARS detail that needs to be there for that particular kind of issue. But for purposes of the ADOT legislation, I don't think we have to broach that at this point. Open for discussion and glad to go find information otherwise, but I believe that's how we are at this point.
Is there a way to approach this? I mean, in reading it, when you look at it, it does do a lot of directives. It says the director shall, even in situations where when you kind of read the rest of the language, the director is coming up with things. And so it's not so mandatory. So if when meeting with ADOT, as Galen was saying, if you're going through and asking, well, just conceptually these things, if the director is establishing standards and they're figuring out the quality, if they agree with the concepts, and you can put into place, okay, these are the standards, these are the scenarios where it makes sense, and ADOT's gonna be on board to install the conduit. They just wanna be told or have the authority that they need to, then they'll do it. And so, I mean, even maybe something with starting, rather than right off the gate saying, shall install broadband, bing, starting off with something of, you know, the director's going with B, establishing the standards, talking about what it is that sets up the scenario where you want this installed, and then when that happens, going to say that they shall install. And would they have as much resistance to the idea of shall when it fits in with what their standards are and what makes sense? Then they're okay with doing it. It seems like they just don't want to be told what to do if everything's up in, everything's up in the air.
Suggestion, if we change the shall to is authorized to, does that get to what your thought is?
That's good.
Yeah.
Is that, and largely
Yeah, I
the
think
other
that's much
requirements
better.
are similar, but
Yeah.
if we change those shells to is authorized to.
Because that's really what they were saying,
Yeah,
right?
they
Is
didn't
they-
want, they did not want unfunded mandates, and these were
Well,
both
but that's
unfunded
different,
mandates.
but now that's different.
Yeah,
But-
well, it
but
was
what
the
they've,
concept
but
was
what they've
unfunded.
always come back with, and we've heard certainly on other folks on the
Right.
task group have heard, is we're not authorized to do that.
Right.
Why did your right-of-way not include anything other than vehicular traffic? We're only authorized for rights-of-way for
So the
vehicular
word
traffic.
is
So-
authorized actually
Yeah, or
replaces
shall
shall.
have the
And
authority
so,
to.
yeah, is authorized
Either way,
to, or
yeah.
has authority to.
Yeah, whatever.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
that can be wordsmith, but does that get to, now that's still in the may category.
Right.
Rather than a shall, so it's not an affirmative, but maybe that's a way to broach this issue. Discussion?
I agree with that.
I think that's,
That-
I think that's good.
And is that capture what you were thinking?
Yeah.
Okay.
That it mattered.
Okay, so in the next draft, we will go to that language.
And there, now, it's up to the legislature at some point to direct. And the word shall,
Now,
at that point, the legislature directs.
now, we're not at all upset if the members come back and substitute shall back in for.
Is authorized.
Is authorized to, and makes it a shall. I mean, but that would be in concert with ADOT, because the ADOT folks are very strong with the legislature, and so it would only be with their knowledge and agreement, I would believe. But obviously, we would be accepting of that.
And there might be places where that is authorized doesn't fit exactly.
Right.
So
But,
Just like there are places where may is appropriate, when it's an exception.
which is what we're saying, we're just saying it in a different way.
Yeah.
Okay. Other issues that people have with that bill at this point?
And the question really is, at this point, if we can satisfy Department of Transportation's concerns about being forced to do a mandate to do certain things that are not part of their current vision or their current authorization or their current role. And they really know what that is. I mean,
Yes.
they know exactly what they really do. and they really don't want to go outside of those boundaries. But now the concepts that we're talking about are the positives that will come out of an actual setting apart of right-of-way and automatic permitting processes, so that providers don't have to do that individually on an ad hoc basis when they want to do something, and have that 3-year permitting process or that 3-year authorization process for
Now,
right-of-way.
that's not in this bill,
I
but that's in
understand
the, and so if we're kind of wanting to get into that next bill, and we have a half an hour left, and so
I
we
know.
need some time for it, and so,
Hey, Mike, I'm sorry, because I know you want to move forward. I do have one more question on this bill before we go, and I hope
Yes.
it's just a quick answer, but
you bet.
on page 2 in subsection F, there's language that reads that the director may waive the application of this section or any provision of it. Basically, if the director determines that such waiver is appropriate with respect to a covered rural highway construction project. What's envisioned in that scenario? What would be the conditions under which the director could waive some of the requirements of this section, just to want to understand that.
That was, ADOT asked for the ability to, they're concerned about the shells again. And they asked for the flexibility in the legislation that, you know, when it really didn't make any sense at all to do something, that they weren't going to have to butt their heads against a brick wall. And so that's the section that came out of the discussion along those lines, where you know, and they didn't have specifics. Floyd and the other folks did not have specifics that they could enumerate, but they wanted that general ability to, as a legislative out, if indeed they felt in their judgment that this particular route or this particular situation does not make sense for us to carry along the conduit. So that's why it's
an issue about waiving their responsibility to execute under this section, as opposed to waiving certain requirements of this section for providers or for projects. And when I say that, I mean, the way I read it, it might imply that the director has the authority to waive some of the requirements that are contained in A, for example. Do you know what I mean? That if you if you read it literally, it might suggest that the director has the ability to waive application of some of the statutory requirements, which doesn't sound like that's the intent. It's really more intended to say they can decide not to proceed on a project at all, not waiving different requirements of the project.
I hear you loud and clear. We need, and so what you're suggesting is we need limiting statements relative to how much their waiver. And I think that's a very good suggestion, and I'm glad to wordsmith some limiting statements on that waiver that we provided for them. And again, that'll be some back and forth with ADOT, but I think you know, limiting statements are always a good structural idea.
Yeah, I think, Susan, you're right. I think the way it's written, it would allow them to just opt out of the law of this, if they thought it was appropriate.
Yeah, and so excellent, Susan. Thank you for bringing that up.
One of the things that was brought up was that they didn't want to build bridges to nowhere. They also needed better direction as to continuity or continuous paths rather than wait for a greenfield situation or a build situation or a maintenance situation. They wanted to make sure that there was a priority driven, I mean, they would be directed by somebody else as to when and where they would build conduit. Now, it is not a bad idea when they're constructing something or maintaining something, but they're doing a checkerboard form process to actually put conduit in then based on a certain standard. But they do not generally want to have bridges to nowhere. And so it's up to, again, this goes back to the authority side, which we haven't talked about yet, as to that relationship of where they put things. First, don't want unfunded mandates. They, second of all, do not want responsibility to decide where to prioritize and put this build out and so forth. They do, what they do very well is kind of making holes, making ditches, and doing those things. But that's, so the sense is here that they need to have flexibility, or they need to have direction, and not do it all the time. But
I think, and
put it part of their big budget.
You bet. And what I'm really getting here is flexibility, but with limits.
Is it even an option for if there's some construction project from Phoenix to Tucson? Is it an option for a provider to say, yeah, we'd love to install conduit and joint trench?
Well, it's according to ADOT, they would not like to do that at all. But what they do want to do is entertain anyone who wants to have conduit, and for that to come through an authority or an office, a broadband infrastructure office, to ADOT as a single input, which then they will plan, engineer, and oversee the construction of, and oversee the maintenance of over its lifetime for the use of those of those conduits
Because
by the private sector.
Because those are different things. I mean, the one scenario is ADOT puts in the conduit and says, we built it, do you wanna, who all wants to use it, they lease it out. The other scenario is, hey, we're opening up a hole, and Century Link,
Is
do
there any
you want,
project that wants to go through
yeah,
that?
do you
And
wanna
they-
lay conduit at your own cost? That solves the unfunded mandate, but that raises other
But
issues.
there's-
And they shut that off
They don't
with
wanna
a
do
direct
that.
no, in the discussions thus far. Good question, but that, at this point with ADOT, that's been a non-starter. Whereas they've been able, we've had them, we've made major progress on their overseeing that and maintaining that over its lifetime, and then some other entity like the office or the authority, interfacing with the private sector in terms of the usage and the payment, et cetera, of that. Now, where they will interface is on the maintenance, because they'll only do physical maintenance on the raceways, and they understand that there's physical maintenance required on the fiber at the regeneration bolts, et cetera, et cetera. And so and they have relationships right now with the private sector where similar kinds of maintenance goes on, where they don't own equipment, but it's close to their rights of way or in their rights of way. But where they were just, absolute no was, they're becoming a entity that private sector can go to and say, while your trench is open, let us lay in some pipe.
So do they wanna know that ahead of time?
Well,
To avoid the bridge to nowhere?
Well, there may be, and this leads to a bigger question, and this is, I think, a really important one.
Doesn't care.
Is it going to be the policy of the state to set aside right of way on a general basis for conduit? And is it going to be, shall we say, a policy that for the taxpayers of Arizona to expect that right of way shall be set aside along transportation corridors for purposes of conduit? And I don't know that we've addressed that on how, now the specifics of when that's done and how that's done is what this law kind of addresses right now. But the general concept of having a right-of-way set aside and engineered on a general basis has not been addressed yet.
I mean, overall, it's so much less expensive to just, once that's open, to put it in, but the question always becomes, okay, somebody's gotta pay for that conduit.
Well, one thing we have not discussed, and I hate to introduce it, but if a private company said, I am willing to write the check to have you do the work on your right of way, is that feasible?
Well, that's what I was asking.
Yeah.
Well, now, the answer conceptually is yes, and to that. But it's just the
Statement's still
manner
on
in
it.
which it goes. So that check goes into the office, and then the office, considers that as part of the demand for that particular stretch of
Okay.
highway, and then in an MOU to ADOT, gives ADOT that information, and then ADOT acts as the construction manager and builds that infrastructure and maintains it over the lifetime. So that mechanism is built into the combination of the two bills at this point. And in fact, that's exactly the way it's.
Now-
So that answers your question, though.
And so.
Yes, that is doable.
Because that's how ADOT said we had to do it.
But if the company then says, well, now, they fund the whole thing, do they own then the entire right of way?
And that's,
No.
That,
And the answer was no
No.
at this point. And because question is, what are they funding? They're funding the incremental cost of putting in the infrastructure of the conduit.
do they own the conduit?
And
Or is it a lease?
it's a
payment?
lease on the conduit.
and then there could be some paybacks or some reimbursements, but generally, the conduit then is a shared conduit no matter what. The concept is that
It's a shared conduit.
if there's going to be a sharing along state right of way for that conduit.
Yeah, now the question there, is it a single conduit or multiple conduits? Is that singular or plural? And in those areas where there's significant desire to, lots of people that need broadband services, it's highly likely there's more than one entity that's going to want conduit. And so they each then would pay for their particular dedicated raceway. And we talked about what does that mean. It could be the conduit itself, could be an interduct, could be a microduct, et cetera. But dedicated raceway that's leased to them over some period of time, and whether that's a 99-year lease, you know, or whatever it is, but that's to be negotiated, and that's all within the purview of the office, not the ADOT 2-for-1.
Now, would that be a downer to the providers? Again, the providers are there typically not to help others, but to help themselves.
Yeah, I mean, they probably wouldn't, again, if you're talking, you know, they're not gonna wanna fund an incremental cost of a single conduit that then somebody else is gonna share into,
Right.
but it's a
And
different issue.
And that's why each is going to
leasing.
fund.
Unless it's got the individual, there's no way we would do that. It's just, there's too many ways legally we could get,
Oh,
we could get, yeah, we could get sued pretty
I don't-
substantially based on someone else damaging our facilities.
I don't think this is gonna happen, guys.
Right, let's be clear about this, no, let's not obfuscate, let's be clear about this. In order to make this happen, there aren't any sugar daddies here, so he who wants raceways is gonna pay for its raceways, on it. And let's say it is, well, if there were no conduit between here and Tucson, and let's say it's Phoenix to Tucson, obviously there are many providers who would want their dedicated raceway, and they would pay some amount to lease a dedicated raceway between Phoenix and Tucson for 99 years, pick a number. And that would be the deal that would be made with carrier A and B and C and D, or A only, if it's here to Holbrook or whatever. But the point is that carrier, that provider, is only paying for the particular dedicated raceway for their use, not for everybody else's use on it, and it'll be under a lease, most likely how it's envisioned at this point, and it's still to be determined. So these are open discussions. And so the only thing that's been kind of locked down is what ADOT will and won't do. What the office will and won't do is up for discussion. But the idea is that would be leased for a period of time. That leasehold, and this goes back to Susan's question of what happens if the carrier goes out of business or changes name or is bought or goes through a similar kind of transition and quest for CenturyLink. And the idea is that leasehold would then go to the new entity for the term of the lease, or and it's likely that it could be made such that it could be sold to another entity over a period of time as well. That level of detail doesn't have to be in the legislation, but that's within the rules of the office. But that's the concept.
This is Susan. To that point, I have a quick question for you too then. So is what you're saying if, for example, there was a stretch of highway where conduit was placed that would make available 4 interducts for 4 different carriers, let's say, and you've got one carrier that expresses an interest upfront to access that. That carrier's cost-based cost for accessing that one interduct in that conduit would be 25% of the project cost. And then if a subsequent provider comes along and wants one interduct, they would also pay 25%. So there's not some financial burden, greater financial burden borne by the first provider to pay all of the cost or to split the entire bill. They're only paying a prorated share based on their usage, correct?
That's the concept on it, Susan. And now, and what that implies is the office needs to have a revolving fund and needs to have some set of donations or some set of initial working capital in that revolving fund in order to do exactly what you said. But that's exactly the concept.
Versus a one
On it, such that there's not a penalty for being the first mover for that, such that the second one, for example, if it was an engineered infrastructure for 4 providers, and the first provider would pay 25%, second 25%, et cetera.
Even when there's not a second provider available, the concept is that it would be the standard would be a minimum of say 4 conduits available, but the first provider would only have to pay the cost
of that, of the actual usage. Now then, the other, and Mike Goldman's not here to talk about this, but the other idea is the office would study available populations, uptake rates, and growths in population, for different routes, for different state roadway routing, and that number of raceways will vary depending on the total available market that's out there to be served. And so that's why it's not always eight conduits or 4 or any particular number, but that actual, and then that's what allows the office to more legitimately be able to carry those empty conduits until it finds a carrier or provider to use those subsequent conduits, or raceways within a given conduit, however that turns out to be. But that is the concept. And without that, the idea is that there wouldn't be a great deal of private participation. So I think from the private sector provider perspective, you guys want to weigh in on how you want to see that, but that's the concept at this point.
Well, and we hope that's not make or break.
But again, could we, if we can set those aside and go back to our ADOT, because I want to get ADOT kind of nailed down here. We have 15 minutes left. Are there other issues within the ADOT bill that anyone would like to voice? And going forward from this meeting, I'm certainly open to other suggestions as well. The idea, though, is we would create a version 8, and then the question is that version, what level of concurrence around the table should we have before we trigger to say, okay, Bob, now it's ready to go from your perspective, so we give a handoff in essence to you relative to dropping the bill itself.
Well, I don't know. Who makes that decision?
Yeah,
The council, the task group, or?
And so we need to find out who makes that decision and what that trigger is.
Yeah.
But
Well, we need to hear from ADOT. We can't really
right.
do it.
But the idea that the senator brought up about the folder and opening up a folder so we can do that in advance of
Yes.
doing this, so we make sure we've got input from anyone that wants it, and we give it, we're gonna have to develop a drop dead date at some point, because the bill's gonna have to be dropped at some point. If it's a go, no go at that point.
Pretty quick.
Maybe let me ask that question a little bit differently. What's the general impression around the table of what should that drop dead date be? Because maybe we should work to the drop dead date, and then it's what we have, and we're saying maybe that we must have ADOT's concurrence, but it's what we have as of that date is then what we run with.
Well, when you say drop, that's a term they use in the legislature, drop a bill.
Yes.
That's the drafted bill, and it's a bill packet, and once that's done, it can't be changed unless you go to committee, okay? So up to that point, it's a folder and you can work it, and so.
Okay, so open a folder instead of.
Open a folder, and I would say open a folder as soon as you can get some kind of consensus out of the group. And I don't know that this group, I think maybe the council has to answer that. I
The
don't know.
council is, but see, we're not meeting until when, council?
But, well, okay.
February 9th.
But that doesn't mean that we
Oh.
could not get concurrence back to the council. And I think the council itself still needs to be apprised of something before you do it with the legislature. You can't just, yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to ruffle feathers and
No.
then have people.
And especially since I don't think anybody's gonna debate it. It's just a matter of making sure you follow protocol.
Well, the experts
Yeah.
met here.
And now the council, so we have maybe 2 steps. Certainly the council wants to be aware that we would open a folder, and Mike Golden may make a judgment of whether they're, or Aaron may make a judgment
it'd be Aaron.
of whether they're aware or not, or what specific communique wants to go out in that regard. And then that would trigger us to be able to open a folder.
Yeah.
We can
Now,
do
a
that
folder
by
can be
email,
open
by the way.
today.
And get-
I mean, as long as you've got some language that is, that ledge council can work off of. And you don't need language necessarily, you just need bullet points for them to draft language on. But a folder could be opened right away.
So maybe we could.
And then the other point that you need to get, and Senator Driggs's name was mentioned as a possible person on the Senate side to get involved in this. Now, whether he would want to do that or not, I don't know. And I think it was Stevens on the other side, on the House side. I'm not sure. I wrote the name down and I left my
That would make
paper in
sense.
my car. He's into electronics type stuff, yeah, okay, he would be the guy that would probably be on the House side as at least the first to approach.
Who's the infrastructure person in the Senate? There is a Senate committee called infrastructure.
I think that is,
I don't know if that's right.
John Nelson. And I don't know that you wanna dump this on John Nelson.
No.
So Driggs's name was the one that Wendy gave me.
Okay.
Stevens oversees the committee on new technologies and they created last year, so.
Over in the House, yeah, yeah. And at some point, they need to be brought in. If, if you wanna ask them to sponsor a bill and champion a bill, they need to get in somewhere before it's too late.
Would it be appropriate to invite them to a task group level meeting or to a separate meeting that's a briefing specifically for them?
Well, I think the best way to do it would be a briefing first and then invite them to a meeting. Now, the other thing is, I'm not eligible to lobby until the end of the year, or actually the start of next year. So I gotta be a little bit careful about how I present the information I'm using.
Is lobbying considered education, vice versa?
Would it be worth if you talk to him at all? Has he been, from the legislative side, has Michael been involved at all, from the governor's office?
Yes, Mike
Yes.
Golden has had several.
No, Mike from the government.
Michael Hunter?
Yeah, he has a little bit. And as long as it doesn't concern money, right now, these two are concept bills and don't include revenue or fee bases or
Right.
anything else. They're willing to, these two bills are well known to the governor, and Aaron is authorized.
And Michael Hunter's the person in the governor's office that you've been
Yeah,
working with?
we haven't met with Michael directly. I know Michael, but we met with everybody else. But I think we're authorized to talk with him and so forth. And if we have a need, we bring it up and chat with him.
The majority of those discussions have really been directed
Yeah.
to the governor's office.
Yeah, I would imagine.
Yeah, they're waiting upon us to come up with, they know there's urgency, they know what we're trying to accomplish in this cycle, and some of the issues are then, obviously, we have a number of issues that are part of the ADA type, or ADA, whatever it's called.
The office.
The office issues that also need to be separately created. In fact, that's even more important now, because we found that we parse the differences of every place that we
Yeah, the other point is when the folder becomes the property of a legislator, then you're gonna have to get clearance from them whether they release things or not. Because sometimes people want those folders to be basically closed and worked internally, kind of.
Mhm.
I don't think that's the way to do it. I think the way to do it is to have it out on the table. Get as many people involved stakeholder-wise and get as many wrinkles worked out ahead of time. But, having said that, it is a decision that the sponsor can make.
And this committee is part of the executive, by the way. I mean, this council is part of the executive, and we need to understand that. But also there's constituencies represented here. We did it purposefully so that information can flow both ways. But your point is that when the legislator takes it, then he has control.
Once his name is on it, once he accepts ownership of the folder, then it's his.
And he can do what he needs to do, and he can be open about it, or he can be close about it.
Yeah.
I don't know where Driggs would stand on it, I think he would have.
Oh, Mike, can I ask, because we got about 5 minutes to go, and I talked to Mike earlier today, just to try to give him a little heads up on the things we saw in this other bill that we think are gonna be preempted from the state because of the order coming out from the FCC either Friday or Wednesday. I'm not sure what day that's coming out. So I think if I could request that we either meet by conference or phone to talk about this piece separately, because this, we have more heartburn in here than there because of preemption issues that we just want to try to work through, so,
Yes,
because I
yeah.
don't think it's the intent, it's just, here's what the language causes at this point.
Good. Now, and when specifically, that would be with regard to pulling back from the FCC, the authority over vertical rights of way, or that the FCC is now exercising under 253.
There's a lot of things here with the USF that they're looking at regarding definitions of served, underserved.
Yes.
New one is coming out with this new plan, because it's going to that broadband USF fund.
Yes.
So you're having new rules and actual definitions set up in that plan.
Which goes to our discussion the other day, by the way.
And tied into the national broadband plan, so I mean, to try to make this simple for everyone, I think, taking a look at those when they're released, and trying to adopt as many of those that exist today, that we don't step on each other's toes, probably is gonna make the most sense in here.
Are you seeing any contradictions between any parts of
Yeah.
what FCC rules? I mean, the FCC idea of granting to the states the ability to, in fact, have the cities, I mean, it's basically, it goes past the cities and lets the state gather to itself.
But there's things that are out there, best practice rules, which I think make more sense to adopt their rules than create new best practices from scratch. I mean, because there's things that other entities, not just Cox and ourselves, are gonna have to follow some of these rules, as this plan gets developed and put out. That, again, some of it is gonna completely preempt the state. And you don't wanna put it in here when you're gonna be preempted on the federal side, it doesn't make, you know.
That harmonization is very important, and it's with a moving target right
Right.
now, and we understand that the FCC is moving quickly and will make decisions, and so we need to harmonize.
Will the states that already have that, there's 17 of them right now that already do it.
Well, this
It's
is.
still gonna be, they're still,
They're gonna have to change their,
they're looking at some complete preemptions of corporation commissions.
And so we'll need to see how that breaks out.
You're talking about the most recent NOI on the broadband?
The actual notice, the rulemaking's coming out Friday or Wednesday. We suspect they're gonna ask for more comments, right? I mean, they've tried to build consensus where they can, but they're not slowing down very much. So I imagine they're gonna give everyone one shot to make comments on what comes out, and then try to push rules. Now, granted, we know some states already, they're gonna sue the FCC over these rules.
gee, well, that takes a 5-year.
But they're hustling to get, you know.
It depends what they do, I mean, there were
Right.
some very big comments.
Yep, right.
People, so there's stuff they can do.
Right. So our inkling from what we're hearing is they're gonna give everyone one more shot at the rules, and, you know, trying to come to a better consensus. 'Cause there's
And
some
Mike, what
places-
you're hearing is this Friday or next Wednesday, is that likely? No guarantee.
FCC's having a party right now, so I'm not kidding. So they either are done for the holidays, so it's either, we originally thought Friday, but we've heard from other providers that they think Wednesday before Thanksgiving is coming out.
Are the rules are the definitions with regard to underserved, unserved, and so forth, do you think those are pretty solid?
Susan, I don't wanna speak for you, I think on our side, that one I think is probably the least controversial of what's out there.
In terms of the FCC side?
Yeah, and underserved and unserved.
Yeah. Now, I have a few questions about the definition that's in the bill draft that we're looking at, but not based on what the proposed FCC standard is.
Is it similar to what NTIA came up with when they did the top stuff?
No,
Really?
this is very different.
Really, okay.
Okay, well, maybe it's good that we focused on ADOT today, because that is a big new change that has to be absorbed with the office legislation. And if it's going to come out this Friday or next Wednesday, then we have to absorb that.
There may
and
be a
then-
whole
and
section that
see-
doesn't even apply anymore.
And we need to, right, we need to
Right.
see how that reflects, and so Mike, thank you for that heads up on
Yeah.
it. And so so maybe if we can talk about, when should this group meet again? And it sounds like it should be based on that coming out and having some time to digest that.
Yeah, and Susan, I don't know how long it's gonna take your organization, I imagine it's gonna take ours about 2 weeks to work through what comes out, to have at least a better grasp of it.
Is it possible we could have 3 bills then? I mean, maybe there's a part that we could talk about, which has to do with Arizona right-of-way, and the office as it relates to right-of-way in Arizona.
But that's covered, I mean,
But-
this notice, everything was on the table.
That's what you were saying, Mike, is that it may preempt the
Not
ability.
specific part.
But, you know, one of the things, I'm just throwing this out, something to think about. I mean, obviously, there's a point where you wanna run your trial, or you wanna run your test. I don't necessarily know that this has to be completely done before you get to that point. Because the learnings you may have out of that may change some of the language, it's something to think about. May change some of the detailed language that you're gonna want eventually in here based on your learning. So, you know, it's something to think about, looking at it that way too.
I believe that's going to be the case for the office legislation. Now, Mike, do you think that would be true also for the ADOT
I'm
legislation?
less concerned about that.
Yeah, I believe, so are we, as a working perspective right now, if we say we cleave off the ADOT bill and then continue with it on a path, because that sounds like the one that won't necessarily be interrupted, and it can be changed if we're wrong, if we're incorrect in that assumption, it can change until the actual bill is dropped. But we could go ahead with the opening of a folder there, working with Senator Griggs or Representative Stevens, et cetera, within that context, and get that process kind of aligned and more public, while we're still back in the cutting room, table, understanding how to harmonize with the federal rule set that's coming out.
Yeah,
for
and this
the
isn't
office.
taken forever, this is more,
Yeah.
I think you're gonna have an industry idea where what industries are happy or not a lot sooner than obviously any legal action that happens beyond that.
Now, technical question regarding the Senate and House. Do we need to have it opened by a senator and a representative? Or is a senator sufficient and then he can look at co-sponsors?
Well, I think you ought to work both sides.
Think that's okay.
I mean,
So we need to have 2 voters.
depends on where you sit, how you stand.
Yeah.
I mean, there's always some who discourage introduction on both sides because it's a duplication and cost and so forth, but you gotta put the bill passed in both houses, so if you can get a champion on both sides, you're a lot better off.
We can always.
And so I would suggest you talk to both of these guys, and if they decide they're not interested, then try to get them to give you somebody that is interested, maybe that they think might be interested. Just pick their brain if you can to find out if there's somebody else. I think, based on my conversation with staff this morning, I think they'll still be thinking about somebody else too possibly, but that was the first 2 people that came to their mind. Driggs on the Senate side and Stevens on the House side, so.
Adam's a friend of mine, so I don't know if I have authorized it.
Well, and we're a little past our time today. I think we made good progress on the ADOT bill. I really want to thank everybody for their inputs in that regard. I'll take my notes and update for our next draft of that. Would really appreciate just turning on change control and making any comments that you'd like to. And then the next thing we'll do is we'll sit down with Floyd at ADOT as soon as we can. And then when would this group like to next meet? We asked that question, but I don't think we really arrived at it. If we assume we key it to the federal output, and there's a federal output, say by the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and then Mike, you were suggesting 2 weeks for digesting.
Just to have a general idea, I think, of where everyone is on that. I think, and I'm speaking on behalf of my company, I know it's good, in about 2 weeks, we expect to probably have a pretty good sense. You know, we have a pretty good idea what we think is gonna be.
Well, what's 2 weeks from Wednesday before the next sitting? That'd be the 22nd plus 2 weeks, would be
Like second week of December.
Second week of December.
which is around the 13th or 12th or something like that.
And what day of the week is better for everyone? And I think what ACID is attempting to do is either the meeting start at 8 o'clock, 10:30, 1:30.
Not 8 o'clock.
So not, so
Home in
10:30
Gilbert.
or 1:30.
Yeah, 8 o'clock's
I
great.
believe it.
They actually started the meeting this morning at 8.
Yeah, that's right.
One gentleman who came in from
Sure.
Scottsdale said he made it here just in time.
I got there at 15 minutes after, traffic was horrible.
I mean, I've got this time kind of set aside. It's been, you've been kind of consistent on
1:30
a
would be
Thursday.
appropriate.
Fridays I know are off, and
So
Mondays.
2
are
weeks
off.
from Thanksgiving, which is
Now-
gonna be the 23rd plus 1st plus 8th. Is it
So-
December 8th?
And then my question is,
So probably
is Thursday or is there another time?
On December what?
Be 2 weeks from
December-
The first is
December 8th
Thursday,
is-
the 8th
December 8th is good for
Yeah,
me.
December 8th is a Thursday.
I can't be here.
So,
I'll be in Flagstaff.
yeah,
I
so
know that for sure.
what's a better time?
That week's just,
Oh, that
The next
week is
week?
not good.
yeah, the next week's much better. That week's just really bad.
So the next week, Wednesday or Thursday
Yeah.
for me is fine.
The next Thursday?
It's the
Which is
14th or
February
15th.
14th.
Now, how does that stack up with the legislative problem? We still have a little time?
Well, yeah, I think if, the dropping of the bill, again, the drop dead date for dropping the bill is the 31st on the Senate side, and then a week later in the House. And I wouldn't suggest you wait for the drop dead date.
No, I
You
think.
need to get in ahead of that line.
Opening
But-
the folder though.
But the folder, yeah, we could open that. I think you could open that up,
Up through Christmas.
yeah, anytime. that-
Mike?
Yeah, I think anytime you've got some kind of a consensus of
15th?
language, I'd say that would be the time to do it.
Is open in this room at 10:30
On the 15th of December.
on the 15th, if you like that.
9th of December. Let's see, is that formal?
I'll make it work. So.
You'll make it work, okay.
That's a Thursday.
And
That works for me.
so
Okay.
15th at 10:30?
Okay, I'll put it on here.
And
Su- Susan?
And
that work for you?
Susan, is that good for you?
yes, that works for me.
Okay, so 15th at 10:30.
I'll have to call in. I'm gonna be in Vegas.
Good luck.
You won't call in.
Yeah, I
I
will.
don't have clocks or
I get
phone.
bored in Vegas.
After you win, we'll know
I'm
if
going-
you don't call.
I'm going with my wife to the Colorado River Water Conference. And I won't be attending, I'll just be,
Sitting.
yeah.
Mike,
Yeah,
I
we'll
will
try to
reserve the
yeah, you
room
can
if you
call
can
me.
handle the logistical.
Close your eyes and
Thank
look at
you.
all of us and go to sleep.
Okay, well, again, I want to thank everyone for participation today and your thoughts and going forward for the additional inputs. As you could tell from the discussion today, when we get into the office legislation, that's where all the fun is.
Yes.
And, that's where, that's the end of the pool everyone gravitated to today. So that's really the subject of our next, so next time we'll probably spend about a half an hour on the ADOT, I would suspect. And, and then the majority of the time will be on the office legislation, because that's what the FCC information will impact.
And Susan, I got your email today, and I'm going to answer those questions as quickly as possible to you.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Okay,
And Mike, to your point about the discussion around the other bill next time, would it be useful to you if we provided to you before our next meeting just some sort of high-level questions or issues based on our review? I mean, some of the stuff can probably take off the table with a point of clarification. And my thought there is that if we can kind of weed out the stuff that's minor tweaks that need to be made for clarification and the stuff that's more substantive, maybe it makes our time more useful the next time we get together. Would that be
Absolutely.
useful?
Yeah.
Absolutely, Susan. I think that's, around the table,
Yeah,
that's
'cause
a
there's a
good,
different
that's a good
level of-
idea.
Yeah.
Because if we really can weed out the lesser things and, kind of have a consent agreement, or agenda almost for those things. And then the thorny ones, let's spend our time eyeball to eyeball.
Our whole purpose in this is to reduce the cost to the providers of putting in infrastructure. Our whole purpose. so that both speed, time is money, and also actual cost. Lawyering is expensive. For those lawyers, sorry, we want to eliminate some of your work.
We almost have you outnumbered in the room. You should be careful.
I realize that. I realize that. But, you know, sometimes lawyers have their own self-interest.
That's a joke.
Sometimes they don't. Some of the really good ones. But nevertheless, if we can reduce the cost to the providers, that's the whole purpose of this.
Okay.
And good process will do that.
Yep.
Right.
Good process will do that better than any
Anything.
regulation
We have no
or
hidden
any
agenda,
other.
other than, you know, and for the citizens of Arizona, we have this wonderful resource out there.
This conference is no longer being recorded.
Thank you. We have great resource out there that the state can help with, which is called our right-of-way, and good policies. Those are the other things